So this is just a quick slideshow I made to introduce our new unit on ecosystems and ecology. All right. So an ecosystem is all the living organisms in an environment in their physical and chemical surroundings. So basically, I have a picture here of a forest. So it's everything that lives in the forest, but it's also the amount of light that the forest gets and the amount of water. And then I have a picture here of the ocean. So it's fish, coral, everything that lives in the ocean, algae, and then it's also, again, temperature, salt level, pollution, everything that affects the environment. I put a picture here of someone's mouth, gross, because we actually have lots of ecosystems living in our bodies too. So our mouth is actually its own sustainable natural ecosystem. And we have the same thing going on in our intestines. There's actually more living things living on us than there are our own cells that make us up. So that's a pretty cool fact. Okay, so there are two things that can influence an ecosystem. What I mean by influence, so there's two things that can increase the growth of an ecosystem or decrease an ecosystem, like the populations in it. So the first type of thing that can influence an ecosystem is something called a biotic factor. So don't overthink this. If it's biology, it means living. So biotic factor is anything that's alive in an ecosystem. So that's not too hard to think about. So a perfect example is anything that's a plant or an animal, it's a biotic factor. Bacteria is a biotic factor. Fungus is a biotic factor. If it's alive, it's a biotic factor. And then the opposite of that is right here, something called an abiotic factor. So an abiotic factor is anything that's not living in an ecosystem. Don't confuse this with something that's dead. Something that's dead was actually once living. So that would actually be a biotic factor. These are anything that were never once alive. So for example, temperature is not alive. Sunlight isn't alive, water, oxygen. So those four main things are all considered abiotic factors because they were never living. A rock is also an example of an abiotic factor because it was never living. It's just a rock. All right, so biotic factor, living, abiotic factor, non living. So those are the two key things to remember for what you're doing today, this week. The last thing I want to talk about before I end is there are two main types of ecosystems that we're going to be talking about. So the first one is a terrestrial ecosystem. That's what we're all living on. So terrestrial ecosystems, these are land-based ecosystems. And I just put a couple examples here. Desert is one, forest is another, and then like the town of Huntsville or a city is also its own terrestrial ecosystem. And then the opposite of that is an aquatic ecosystem. So an aquatic ecosystem is anything that's based in the water. So an example would be like Fairy Lake or Lake of Bays. So any sort of lake, and then an ocean. Also, a swamp is an aquatic ecosystem. A stream is one. So those are the two main types of ecosystems. So now that you've listened to this and gone through what an abiotic factor is and what a biotic factor is, so I'll go back to biotic is living, remember. Abiotic is non-living. And then down here, there are terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Now you can answer the questions that follow this and the quick assignment for this week. Thanks, guys.